Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Radio podcast number 5. Today, we're going to be discussing radio telephony with the control tower, also known as aerodrome. So for some of you already starting out with your private pilot license, this will be very handy. But for everybody that's interested in what is tower aerodrome and how is radio telephony associated with this process, you've come to the right place. All right, so what we're going to discuss today is basically an introduction to tower air traffic control. We're going to define each one of the positions that you could come across when in communication with the tower, and then just a brief overview of the types of communication that you can expect. Now, most control towers globally normally have 2 controllers in the tower. They are defined as ground and tower. What that means is the ground-defined air traffic controller is controlling traffic on the ground. Yeah, that's quite easy to remember. And the tower controller, they're controlling traffic in the air. Okay, so I'm keeping it very simple and very basic. A couple of you out there that are air traffic controllers or pilots are saying, yeah, but what about telling us about movement area and maneuvering area? That will come in a later podcast series. Today, we're just going to focus on who are these people in the control tower and what is the associated radio telephony. The average control tower globally will have 2 ATCs manning it. Might not necessarily be a 24-hour station, but they do have 2 controllers manning the control tower while it is operational. One will be defined as ground, and the other person will be defined as tower. What this basically means is the ground controller is the person that manages aircraft while they're on the ground. So in other words, on the taxi and on the startup. Whereas the other person defined as tower controller is controlling aircraft on the runway and flying in the airspace. The airspace as defined by the aeronautical chart for that particular area. Now, sometimes these 2 controllers will combine to work on one frequency, and then at smaller stations, there will be one controller working both positions, i.e. tower and ground. Those are generally a smaller control center, so the airspace is limited, there's less traffic movement in that airspace, and it's generally used for what we would call VFR, visual flight rule training. Might not necessarily always be that, but that is the general trend when it comes to smaller airspace. Now, if we look at the bigger airfields, so in other words, we look at an international airport, there is the possibility that you're going to have at least 3 air traffic controllers in the tower on a 24-hour cycle operational. That is tower and ground, who we have already made reference to. And the third controller work in this sector is known as clearance or clearance delivery. Now, this particular position is, as the name says, purely to give the pilot who's calling through on frequency their associated clearance. In other words, clearance to enter controlled airspace, and that's upper airspace, and information such as the weather. That would be the QNH, what is the current time, and what is the slot time. So in other words, what time should they be at the holding point ready for departure? Remember, I'm keeping this very basic in my explanations. We can go much deeper, but the focus here is specifically on RT with aerodrome control. So that's where we're going to keep it for this podcast. Now, if you're going to be operating at a smaller center, then obviously you're not going to have the clearance delivery there as well, because the airspace is relatively small. In other words, vertically and laterally, it's limited in size and dimension. And the pilot only really intends to use it for training purposes. They're not flying commercially, and they're not going to be heading off into upper airspace to fly to another destination, for example. So the person who has been rostered to work clearance delivery will be a person who's giving the relevant clearances for that international airport only. When you're flying at a smaller center where there's the tower and the ground controller, there's associated RT that goes with each. And the same process will be managed if you find at a station where there's only one controller working combined with both sectors, i.e. ground and tower. We're going to focus as an overview on the radio telephony that you need to comply with when speaking to ground and when speaking to tower. We'll give one example of what could be expected with clearance delivery. And remember, this is purely example. So the airfield that we'll use is fictitious. The procedure that we use might not be the same at every single airfield globally, but the process that we're following in this podcast is the same throughout. Okay, does that make sense? Right, so I'm going to give you a very basic example of the day in the life of a student pilot flying at an airfield where there's air traffic control supplied, and they're going to be speaking to each controller individually, i.e. the ground controller first, then the tower controller, and give you an idea of what you can expect if this is the type of airfield that you're going to be operating at. For my examples, I've brought in some animated colleagues of mine so that you can hear alternative voices, and then you can associate each voice with that particular position.
Ground, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, ground, pass your message.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, parked at Echo Hangar, request start for AVFR flight to the general flying area, 2 people on board.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, time check 1026, QNH 1018, runway 27, startup approved at own discretion, report ready for taxi.
Time check 1026, QNH 1018, runway 27, startup approved at own discretion, report ready for taxi, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie.
Once the aircraft is ready for taxi, they will say the following to ATC on frequency.
Ground, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie ready for taxi.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie taxi Bravo, Echo holding point runway 27.
Taxi Bravo, Echo holding point runway 27, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie.
At any point during this aircraft's taxi, the ground controller will hand them over to the tower frequency for departure if 1. It is safe to do so, and 2. If they have advised tower about this departing aircraft's intentions.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, ready for departure contact tower, 118.1.
Ready for departure contact tower, 118.1, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie. Tower, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, ready for departure.
Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie, runway 27, surface wind calm, cleared for takeoff. After departure, turn left, climb to 1500 feet, report zone outbound.
Cleared for takeoff. After departure, turn left, climb to 1500 feet, report zone outbound, Tango 7 Alpha Bravo Charlie.
I hope you guys have enjoyed that. Now, for information, if you were going to be flying at an airfield where tower and ground have been combined onto one frequency, then you would call that position ground on first contact. Does that make sense? So on first contact, you call them ground. When you're on the ground, it might not always make sense for you if you're in flight and you're coming from somewhere else flying to that airfield. But the position is referred to as ground, and it would be on the ground frequency. Now, obviously, air traffic control for that sector will publish the relevant notification on the associated, what we call NOTAM, Notice to Airmen, to advise everybody of the combined frequency, if they're combining ground and tower. If that particular airfield is published as only one frequency for both sectors, i.e. tower ground, then there's no need for them to publish any additional relevant notification or notice to airmen, and you would follow the same process as you are speaking to ground and tower, except you're only going to be speaking to one air traffic controller on one frequency while operating in that particular airspace. I mentioned earlier on in this podcast that we were going to give an example of speaking to clearance delivery as well. So again, I've called in my animated colleagues They're going to do the necessary talking for us. Take a listen to clearance delivery, passing the clearance to an airline, and then we'll speak to you again straight after.
Clearance, Talking Radio 102.
Talking Radio 102, clearance, pass your message.
Talking Radio 102, stand, Bravo 4, request clearance for a flight from Newville to Infinity, flight plan reference N06.
Talking Radio 102, cleared from Newville to Infinity, after departure runway 27 comply with the Newville, 2 Alpha departure, airborne frequency 123.7, squawk 1236.
Cleared from Newville to Infinity, after departure runway 27 comply with the Newville, 2 Alpha departure, airborne frequency 123.7, squawk 1236, Talking Radio 102.
Talking Radio 102, read back correct, time check 1102, QNH 1028, contact ground for start 121, decimal 9er.
Read back correct, time check 1102, QNH 1028, contact ground for start 121, decimal 9er, Talking Radio 102.
All right, I hope you guys enjoyed that example, and obviously it's all fictitious, the airfield and the routing, etc. But the principle behind the communication, that's what's relevant. So I hope that this podcast has helped clear up a little bit more as to what procedures take place with the communication with air traffic control in the tower. And as I always say, remember that this is a human working in the tower, just like you listening to the podcast. So if you ever have any queries or concerns, you're not sure about something for that particular airfield, give ATC a call, or if the situation allows, go and visit ATC, have a chat to them, introduce yourself, and also get a chance when in the tower just to observe and see what can they see when they're working in the control tower. And you'll be amazed at how open and receptive they can be when you come to see them and discuss your concern. Thanks for tuning in again today to this podcast. Our next one, number 6, is going to focus on what we call approach procedural, also known as non-radar. Thanks very much. See you soon.